Rania Khalek, welcome to Primo Nutmeg.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on the show. I've been a fan of yours for a long time, and there's lots of news to go over, especially some breaking news that's just happening in regards to Trump and Netanyahu announcing a Mideast Peace Deal. But the very first thing I wanted to talk about today, since this impeachment political theater has been going on for a while, it's a little strange to me just because it seems as though we all know the outcome of it. We all know that Trump is not going to be removed from office. So my question for you would be, do you have any insight into why the Democrats might be doing this? Is it just to hurt Trump leading up to the election? Is it just some kind of distraction overall? Or just what are your thoughts on why Democrats have pushed impeachment and are continuing it into the Senate?
Yeah, it's not like impeachment's going to happen because it's not going to pass through the Senate. We know that. Democrats know that. So all I can guess is that a lot of this is about theatrics. They do think that this is an issue. Maybe not all Democrats, but a certain segment of them do believe that this is like an issue they can push for the upcoming election. I think that's unwise because I don't think most Americans really care about the kinds of things that they're talking about. I mean, Trump has done so many destructive, disastrous things, and they're focusing on the most the most boring elements of what Trump might have done. A lot of it's based on conspiracy theories about, Russia, the issue with UkraineGate. It's like a lot of it's like based on Trump not wanting to give aid to Ukraine, which America's been basically arming and aiding neo-Nazis in Ukraine. These are issues that involve things that most Americans just don't pay attention to or care about. And even as somebody who's like really politically engaged, because I have to be for my job and I want to be, I find it very, very difficult to sit and watch these impeachment hearings and just all of this coverage about RussiaGate and UkraineGate without my eyes glazing over. It's incredibly boring. It's hard to keep up with. It's hard to follow. And it has nothing to do with the issues that people actually care about, like healthcare and like student debt and like retirement and these kinds of things that actually affect everyday people. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, what other than theatrics and maybe just thinking that like they can get attention and hurt Trump, what Democrats really seem to think they can gain out of this, because I think it's really out of touch with most of the country.
Yeah, and again, I seem to think maybe it may have a relationship to RussiaGate insofar as RussiaGate really was a failure that blew up in Democrats' faces. You saw that with the Mueller hearings, just where he was unable to kind of articulate things in his own report. He forgot things in his own report, and it was really just an embarrassment overall to the Democrats. And I'm thinking maybe this is kind of a way to pivot off of that to say that, well, regardless, he still committed a crime, and to kind of blur everything in everybody's head where it doesn't matter so much that RussiaGate was proven to be a farce because they found some kind of loophole where he may have suggested some quid pro quo on this call with the Ukrainian leader.
Sure. And, I also think maybe there is like an end game, because this is a way to kind of use these issues to push, this new Cold War even harder, to push for more aggressive, militaristic American policies. You've got someone the guy who's basically come out as the face of the impeachment is Adam Schiff, somebody who receives a lot of money from, the weapons industry. He's very close with the intelligence community. He's very, very hawkish. So, there is this sort of benefit to those kinds of people, is to shift the conversation to this like anti-Russia hysteria and like this need for a new Cold War, this need to like ramp up U.S. military efforts, around NATO. These kinds of things definitely do benefit from this narrative just kind of overtaking the airwaves constantly.
And, somebody who's really fallen victim to this whole process, I think, is Tulsi Gabbard, because not only has she been smeared from the beginning as somebody who Russia was supporting. We saw this even the day where she was announcing her candidacy. There was an NBC News report that relied on information from the company New Knowledge that Russia was going to be backing her campaign. You also saw her getting slandered by Hillary Clinton, who she's now suing because she suggested that she was a Russian asset.
I'm not making any predictions, but I think they've got their eye on somebody who's currently in the Democratic primary and are grooming her to be the third-party candidate. She's the favorite of the Russians. They have a bunch of, sites and bots and other ways of supporting her so far. And that's assuming Jill Stein will give it up, which she might not, because she's also a Russian asset.
I actually also, when I had Jill Stein on the show, asked Jill Stein about this, and she said that she was also considering legal action over that comment. So I did want to bring it back to the Hillary Clinton thing, because I did have a question about that, because she said you are a Russian asset, pretty clearly. You've also had these smears against you from various, public figures in the corporate media and politicians. Have you ever considered any kind of legal action or lawsuit against any of these people? Mm-hmm. Are you going to be pursuing?
We'll see. I'm sort of exploring whether that's possible or not. Because it's not a small thing. It's
Sure.
not a small thing to have to turn your life around to fight these smears.
Right.
But to my mind, it's not just the smears we're fighting. We're really fighting a democracy that's been hijacked. And it's very important to break that stranglehold right now. So, to my mind, it's a battle worth fighting, and I'm fighting for much more than myself. But if I had my druthers, there are other ways I would rather be fighting that battle.
And then you also saw this where Tulsi Gabbard, because she didn't want to fall victim to this, hyper-partisan theater, just voted present, which, by the way, when I had Mike Gravel, former Senator Mike Gravel recently was on my show, he said that he would have voted present also for the same reasons. So I don't know, maybe could you speak about that a little bit? What are your thoughts on Tulsi Gabbard and how she may have fallen victim to this NeoMcCarthyism? And do you think that her campaign is effectively doing anything to fight back against that Russia hysteria?
That's a great question. And when you put it like that, it actually does. I do want to note, like, a lot of the anti-Russia hysteria and RussiaGate stuff, and then this ongoing impeachment narrative about RussiaGate, UkraineGate, has also been used to demonize and ostracize anyone who challenges the establishment when it comes to the issue of war. And I think no one has done that more loudly and vocally and effectively the last year or two than Tulsi Gabbard, as somebody who's like in office, who's a very public person, who's on TV. And that's why she has been so relentlessly targeted by this like Cold Warrior national security state apparatus that involves like a mix of Congress people like Adam Schiff and then like all of these different think tanks you typically receive funding from the State Department or like the National Endowment for Democracy, in addition to all these news media personalities going after her. And I think it speaks to the broader issue of what this has meant for anybody who challenges endless war or anyone who challenges the establishment, whether it's people like Tulsi Gabbard or even the media, because a lot of the focus of RussiaGate has been on trying to frame anyone who challenges the U.S. regime change apparatus as being a Russian disinformation plot. And that's been an attack not just on Russia-affiliated media, but also on alternative media, on left media, on progressive media, on third-party candidates. I mean, that was the whole idea with attacking Jill Stein as a Russian asset, right? She's a third-party candidate who challenges the two-party system. Therefore, let's target her and call her a Russian asset. It's just a way for the rotten, decaying center establishment to get out of having to answer for any of the disasters that have come out of the policies that they've been pushing the last several decades. Because we're at a point where, rhetoric is really popular, whether it's coming from Trump or like Bernie Sanders. That's a challenge to the mainstream. That's a challenge to the center. And so their way to deal with that is to basically frame all of us, anybody who challenges them, as being a part of Russian disinformation, a Russian plot to sow discord in the country. And so it's definitely fallen mostly on Tulsi Gabbard because she's been like the face of challenging that. And I do think that she's effectively pushed back on it. I mean, I think Tulsi Gabbard has, sometimes when I watch her, I'm always really impressed with the way she responds in the media. They're so hostile to her. And she stays really calm. She's got her talking points together, and she responds in like a way that gets across.
But you know what? I hear you on this, Congresswoman. I hear you on this. I hear you on this. So I want to go with this for a moment. So when sitting down with someone like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, do you confront him directly and say, why do you order chemical attacks on your own people? Why do you cause the killings of over 500,000 people in your country?
Look, you know, I want to break this down to what we're talking about.
It's really a yes or no answer.
I want to break this down to what we're talking about here today, because you're talking about a meeting that took place, what, 3 years ago?
Well, Congresswoman,
and every time I come back, every time I come back here on MSNBC, you guys talk to me about these issues. It sounds like these are talking points that Kamala Harris and her campaign are feeding you because she's refusing to address the questions that were posed to her.
Congresswoman, it's important, I think, for the American people to have context about your foreign policy issues and where you stand. If you're leading with foreign policy and you're running for the president of the United States, a meeting with Bashar al-Assad, which I'm sure you understand, is a very controversial meeting to take. Hence the reason why when you come on MSNBC, it is important for us to talk to you about that. And of course, every anchor has a different perspective and different questions to ask of you.
Every single time for 3 years. This is where the propaganda comes in, because I've talked about this a lot for the last 3 years. And I've talked about how, as a soldier, I served in a field medical unit in Iraq, where every single day I saw the very high human cost of war. Every single day, the first thing that I did was go through a list, name by name, of every single American casualty and injury that had occurred the day before. So I will not apologize to you or to anyone for doing all that let me finish, for doing all that I can to prevent our country from continuing to make these perpetual wrong decisions that have taken a toll on the lives of my brothers and sisters in uniform. I will continue to do all that I can to make sure that we end these wasteful regime change wars that have taken such a toll on all of us and that have made our country less safe. And if that means having a meeting with a dictator, if that means trying to meet with Kim Jong-un in North Korea to de-escalate tensions and remove this nuclear threat from our country and our people, whatever the crisis is, we've got to have a leader with the courage to do the right thing for the American people, putting their interests ahead of everything else. That is what I'm focused on. And that's what's at the center of my foreign policy and the leadership that I'll bring as president.
I certainly am not asking you to apologize for your service. I'm very thankful for your service.
And I think you can see that she's been successful because given the fact that she is she's a member of Congress from Hawaii. She's not like a senator or a governor. And the fact that she's been able to build this coalition around her, she has a pretty large grassroots base that she's been able to build in like a year. And she's been able to push through into the mainstream. So I think that she's been quite effective at pushing back on that, both as a legislator and just as like a personality that comments on these issues.
So in regards to the election overall, it seems as though Bernie Sanders is surging right now. At least that's the narrative. I kind of have my own suspicions about whether he's actually surging or if, just through these manipulated DNC polls and the media, we've been getting an incorrect picture up until now when people are actually going to start voting. But in any regards, I'm just curious if you have any insight into how you think the election might unfold. Do you think that Bernie is going to easily, start winning? It seems as though he's really pulled ahead in Iowa. It seems as though he's pulled ahead in New Hampshire. Do you think that he may actually end up coming away clean with the nomination?
I think if you asked me a couple months ago, I'd say like it's still really iffy. But given the poll numbers, and given that he's only, seems to be increasing in the last month, it keeps going higher and higher. Given the level of grassroots support he has, the donor base he has of grassroots supporters, who continue to be a reliable source of funding for his campaign, given the energy and enthusiasm, I think there's a real chance, especially on top of that, given the weakness of his opponents. I think there's a really, really good chance he could be the nominee. I think that there's still a lot the Democratic Party can do to sabotage that. But it does also seem, based on various media reports, that even Democratic Party insiders and elites are sort of coming to accept the fact that he might be the nominee, that they kind of okay, we got nothing else. I mean, they're going to try to stop it, but if he wins state after state, especially in the beginning, which it's increasingly looking like he will, it's going to be this domino effect that they can't stop. So then the question becomes, it's too early to get too excited about him being the nominee, but let's say he is, then the question becomes, okay, say he is the nominee and he goes up against Trump and he defeats Donald Trump, which is also not a given, but I think he would. But let's say all that happens. I would predict that the Democratic establishment is going to join in with the Republicans in not allowing him to govern on any of the issues he wants to pass. And I guess we'll talk about that when we get there. But I do think it's a discussion that people need to start having is, okay, if Sanders does win, like how are I guess people who support him gonna help make it work? Because he's gonna be dealing with two parties, not just one, but two parties that stand against most of what he wants to enact as president.
Yeah, I think that is a given that if he were to get elected, a lot of the Democratic Party would stand against him. But even, I mean, before that, moving into the election, something that's interesting is that Michael Bloomberg has said that he is going to help support the nominee regardless of who that is. I honestly can't see Michael Bloomberg backing Bernie Sanders as a nominee. I would suspect that he would probably run as a third-party candidate, or that we would see, some sort of push, by the center for some kind of corporatist, neoliberal, neoconservative candidate. Don't you think that would be likely for November if Sanders is the nominee?
I mean, it's possible, but if they did that, they would be guaranteeing Trump would win because they would end up splitting the Democratic vote. And they would be doing everything that they stand against any third-party candidate ever doing. Like, if they did that, I think they would doom their own party. I imagine there's people who would want to do that, but I mean, it seems like even if you're like a Democratic Party elite who's like what they call a moderate or ever, you're a corporate Democrat hack, like even a corporate Democrat hack has to see how bad that would be for them. So I think the more likely outcome, maybe I'm wrong, but I think the more likely outcome would be that they would like begrudgingly accept him as the nominee, not really do much to help him get elected, and then once and maybe even some of them would advocate against him and wouldn't mind a second Donald Trump presidency. But what you would see was more likely happen is they would try to insert their own people into his administration and then make it very, very, very difficult for him to do anything he wants to do. And basically kind of do what they've done to Trump. I mean, I can't stand Donald Trump, but it's pretty obvious that at the end of the day, what RussiaGate was an attempt to like make him unable to do anything during his presidency and to almost try to like overthrow him, if you will. I think that you would see something along those lines between like coming from like the national security state against Bernie Sanders, where they try to like portray him as like, whether it's being a Russian ass or whatnot, they will try to do something like that to him. Like that should be expected. But I think that's the more likely outcome than running a third party candidate, because that would just like guarantee the Democratic Party would like disintegrate.
And we already saw in 2016, or in RussiaGate, we saw these accusations that Bernie Sanders was benefiting from Russian propaganda. We've all seen the silly Facebook ad with Bernie Sanders in a Speedo. That was a main facet of RussiaGate, is that Russia was backing the Bernie Sanders campaign. Something that has been really sad about Bernie Sanders since then is that he really bought onto RussiaGate to some degree. We saw him give a floor speech after Trump met with Putin at Helsinki, where he was just repeating CIA talking points, frankly, and literally quoting John McCain. And we've seen this in some of his rhetoric about democracy versus authoritarianism, directed at Russia. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on Bernie's adoption of these RussiaGate talking points? Do you think that he really believes it? Is he trying to play some kind of political game? Is he trying to avoid being smeared? Is he trying to avoid these neo-McCarthyist smears by sort of buying into the neo-McCarthyism? Or just what are your overall thoughts on Bernie Sanders and RussiaGate?
I mean, I can't imagine Bernie Sanders actually buys into that stuff. He's got to be smarter than that. I think it's a political decision. I don't agree with it. I think when it comes to some foreign policy issues, I think Bernie Sanders still remains very weak. And I think he does a disservice to himself by playing into the RussiaGate hysteria narrative, because it's going to be used on him. So I think he's making a big mistake there. I mean, and I think I think we can't have an illusion, we can't delude ourselves about that. Like, if Bernie Sanders does become president, he's going to have to be pushed on a lot of issues that he's not going to be great on. Like, I agree with you about the whole narrative Bernie Sanders pushes about there's an authoritarian axis, he calls it, which isn't that far from saying that there is an axis of evil. Like, it's not, it's actually really dangerous rhetoric that does play into like a neoconservative idea of the world. So I think that's actually quite dangerous, because he just ends up saying that like the official enemies of America are part of an authoritarian axis. So I think there's a lot that needs to be improved on with Bernie Sanders' foreign policy. I'm not like convinced that it will be. But one thing that about Bernie Sanders that is positive is that he has demonstrated that he does respond to the progressive wing, like his progressive base. He's done it on the issue of Israel-Palestine. A few years ago, Bernie sucked on Israel-Palestine. I remember back in 2014 when Gaza was being bombed by Israel, Bernie Sanders had like a town hall, and a bunch of people at the town hall were demanding that he denounce Israel's bombing of Gaza, and he defended Israel.
Hamas has used money that came into Gaza for construction purposes, and God knows they need roads and all the things that they need, and used some of that money to build these very sophisticated tunnels into Israel for military purposes.
For survival purposes.
Okay, one second.
Yes,
no, I don't want to be interrupted. The question was asked. It's a fair question, and I'm trying to. Look, if you don't,
yes, they did.
you know, excuse me, shut up. You don't have the microphone. You've asked. You know, I don't want police officers here.
You're going to arrest people?
No, I'm not going to arrest people. But are you going to allow us? Are you going to allow us to have a discussion? What do you think?
You come down here. You're up there. Come down and be democratic. So I can discussion with people.
Are you asking for the point?
Occupied populations have the right to resist.
All right. You're entitled to your view. You've asked the question, I'm answering it. This is called democracy.
Let him finish.
All right?
I would thought you were.
All right, I am answering a question, and I do not want to be disturbed.
But, you know, you fast forward a few years and he surrounded himself with people like Cornel West, you know, like Jim Zogby. And before you knew it, he was on stage in Brooklyn at a Democratic debate with Hillary Clinton, you know, doing something unheard of, which is being at a Democratic presidential debate stage and saying Palestinians are human beings that deserve basic rights, which sadly is like a really big deal to say in American politics. But he did that because he was responding to his base. So I guess my point is to say that, like, I am slightly optimistic that when it comes to certain foreign policy issues, Bernie Sanders will respond to his base. I guess the question is whether his base will make that an issue or not. Because sometimes, you know, his progressive base is like so super focused on domestic policy, they don't care about foreign policy. So I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Well, I certainly wish that they would push him a little more on Julian Assange, because he has been almost completely silent on that and has avoided even when journalists have asked him.
Do you support Julian Assange?
Do I support Julian Assange?
Will you pardon him?
It's I can't say it just yet. It's the longest story.
Please, sir, please.
Where are the issue?
Will you pardon him? Commute a sentence, please.
So that's really an issue where I wish he would speak out. But in terms of Russia, you know, I think what is probably going to happen if Sanders wins the nomination is we're going to see both parties trotting out this sort of anti-communist, anti-Russia rhetoric. You know, we always see this with the Moscow Mitch, and Trump is a Putin puppet. And, you know, we've seen that happening. But, you know, with Bernie Sanders being a democratic socialist, we're also going to see this coming from Republicans towards him, that he secretly loved communism and he honeymooned in Moscow. And it seems to me as though the November election might just be both parties, you know, spouting this sort of anti-Soviet propaganda at each other, and it just really being complete silliness and avoiding any sort of actual issues.
That's a really good point, because which you're right. You're gonna have like the Democrats being like what you said, like Moscow Mitch, and like Donald Trump is, you know, Putin's bitch. Oh, sorry, I don't know if I can curse.
Yeah, you can.
But like Donald Trump is like Putin's bitch, and then you're gonna have the other side being like Bernie Sanders is a Judeo-Bolshevik, like communist, like overthrow the American system of capital. It's going to be really, really funny, actually, now that I think about it. I hadn't looked at it like that before. But yeah, that's a real possibility. And, you know, I think you might even have a not insignificant chunk of corporate Democrats joining in with the Republicans on that, if they haven't already. I mean, they've kind of so far shied away from explicitly saying those kinds of things about Bernie Sanders, but I think that's you're going to start to see that more. And then if he becomes a nominee, some of them might jump ship and go to the other side.
So again, I did want to discuss the Mideast Peace Deal that has just been announced by Trump and Netanyahu. Again, this just happened right before we started recording this, but it seems as though they are announcing a plan that would be a two-state solution. It would involve a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. They're suggesting some kind of tunnel between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank so that it would be a contiguous territory. I guess it's the first plan that actually involves Palestinian borders. One thing that seems to be as though it will be a sticking point for the Palestinians is it does legitimize the West Bank settlements. So again, I don't know how much you may have caught before we started recording this, but do you have any general thoughts on what Trump and Netanyahu seem to be announcing here?
Well, I was watching it before we started recording the press conference, and of course it was hard. It was difficult not to notice that Miriam and Sheldon Adelson were sitting in the front. These, of course, are, this pro-Israel billionaire couple. Sheldon Adelson's like a casino magnate who funded much of Trump's last campaign. Because he's a one-issue guy. Israel's his issue, and he's a hardcore right-wing Likudnik who wants all of Israel, to go. So he wants Palestinians removed from Israel, so it can just be a Jewish state with Jews only. And a lot of what Trump is doing is to appease him because he wants, his backing for the next campaign. But I also think, as insane as Trump's peace deal sounds, in some ways it's like a more official version of the end goal of the actual peace deals that have been on the table and taking place for the last several decades, which has led us to this point, right, of being able to, he's talking about legitimizing the settlements and everyone's freaking out, right? That is a big deal. America, first of all, doesn't have the ability to do that unilaterally, but that would be a big deal if those settlements were officially legitimized. But the fact of the matter is that the situation as it's been has allowed for these settlements to exist and get bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where eventually they would be legitimized. And that was under both Democratic and Republican administrations. So it's kind of like an official in-your-face version of what the U.S. has always been kind of pushing for Israel-Palestine without explicitly saying it this way. But I think what's interesting also about this is it almost marketing himself to the pro-Israel lobby for the next election, because he kind of checked off all these things that he has done. He's like, I gave you guys Jerusalem, and I ripped up the Iran nuclear deal, and I killed Qasem Soleimani, whose name he couldn't pronounce. But it was also interesting because he was saying that the Palestinians support it and the Arabs support it, but they actually don't. Even the Saudis and the Jordanians, who are very close American allies, didn't send representatives to this press conference. I think that Trump was saying excitedly that the UAE had someone there and Bahrain had someone there and Oman had someone there. I mean, these aren't countries that represent the Middle East. They're small, tiny Gulf states that are really wealthy and have a lot of oil, but that's about it. And they're American satellites. But mostly I think this also represents this U.S. attempt that's been taking place even before Trump, but has become explicit, which is what they what's called the Gulfification of the Arabs, if you will, which is this attempt to buy off the Arabs and the different Arab states by just giving them money and some development so they'll stop caring about politics. And this has worked in some countries, it's worked in the Gulf states. And it might have been able to work in other countries too, had the U.S. not been so insane, with its behavior in Iraq. But at the end of the day, I don't think you're ever going to see this peace plan, whatever you want to call it, because it's not really a peace plan, come to fruition. I think it was pretty much an election ad campaign for both Trump and Netanyahu. And I mean, I don't know how much longer Trump is going to be in office, assuming that he's not, this definitely won't come to fruition. But even with him in office, he'll never be able to get Palestinians on board with it. And I think the status quo is just going to remain.
And it seems to me, and I think we're even seeing this analysis in the corporate media, that this is really just mainly a distraction, I think, from both Trump and Netanyahu have these, scandals going on. So it seems as though that's really a main part of this, I think, is just to kind of distract from those scandals.
No, 100%, absolutely. Netanyahu is facing criminal probes and then Trump is facing impeachment. And again, like Trump is also coming into an election year soon, and with that, like he actually, it is an election year. I'm sorry, it's 2020, so he is coming into an election year, and with that, like if you watch the press conference, he really did list off like all the things that he did for Sheldon Adelson, like, and for like the pro-Israel lobby, like he was like giving them his credentials, like I killed the Iranian general, I ripped up the Iran nuclear deal, and everybody in the room cheered for him. So I think absolutely that plays into it. Like I'm not like, I don't, you know, the situation is already really, really, really awful and bad. I don't think that this deal or whatever is gonna change that either way. I think you're going to see the situation continue to move in the direction it's been moving in, which is not a good one, until America eventually like has to back out of the Middle East at some point. But as long as America's involved in the Middle East, or unless you get a Bernie Sanders presidency, and even then I'm not sure how much it will change.
Well, all this is also happening during the backdrop of protests in Iraq. There's been massive demonstrations. There's been rocket attacks on the U.S. Embassy there. And this, of course, is coming off the heels of the U.S. Bombing Syria and Iraq, which is kind of it's sad, but, you know, it's also, I think, was predictable because during Bill Clinton's impeachment, he bombed Iraq. We actually saw Trump do the exact same thing, bombing Iraq and Syria, and then killing Qasem Soleimani, as you mentioned. And what was interesting, I think, is that we all kind of thought that maybe the U.S. and Iran may be heading into direct conflict following that assassination. You saw Iran firing some missiles at a U.S. military base. No American soldiers were killed. However, a plane was also downed during that. So what are your thoughts on U.S. and Iran tensions? Do you think that they have tampered down? Do you think that they may flare up again before the election? And also just your thoughts on what's happening in Iraq with these demonstrations. Do you think that that may play into this? Do you think that may actually start floating the idea again that U.S. troops should be leaving the Middle East?
I think that right now it may seem like things have calmed down because they have. But at the same time, the escalatory situation still remains. The U.S. and Iran are on a path to war. Since Trump came into office and ripped up the Iran nuclear deal and imposed crippling sanctions on Iran that's like suffocating the country's economy. And now with the fight against ISIS over, the U.S. can move its attention back to its main target, which is Iran. So I think that like the U.S. and Iran are on like more of a path to war than people realize. They almost went to war after the insane move of killing the Iranian general at the beginning of the year. So I think it's like that's like that people shouldn't become like, oh, okay, it's over now. It's not over. If nothing changes and nothing is de-escalated, the U.S. and Iran will eventually go to war. Like that's the reality of it. It'll happen sooner or later. So what you have to have is de-escalation. The problem is that isn't happening. And you have Trump surrounded by people like Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence, who are these insane apocalyptic end timers who like think Iran is the center of evil, who also blame Iran for like all of the bad that's happened to America from its terrible decisions the last 2 decades. Or even maybe 4 decades. They blame Iran. They think Iran is also the center of evil. So Trump is surrounded by people who want a war with Iran. So the situation right now is not tenable. It's like it's only going to escalate. The U.S. hasn't backed down. They backed down in a game of chicken with Iran because they didn't want a war last month. This in the beginning of the month. But who's to say what will happen 2 months from now? And also people forget you can easily like accidentally stumble into war if all the pieces are in place for war. And the pieces are in place for an Iran and America to go to war. As for Iraq, I think what America did with killing the Iranian general, absolutely made it impossible for Iraqis to have an alliance with Americans. There's a lot of pro-American Iraqis who can no longer be pro-America because of what the U.S. did. The U.S. killed an Iranian general and a revered Iraqi military figure on Iraqi territory. Like they violated Iraqi sovereignty in a very severe way. Iraqis are pissed. The public is pissed. And as a result, that's why you have the parliament demanding the U.S. leave. And now it's become to a point, where the U.S. has put itself in a position in Iraq that like the U.S. embassy is being targeted. Just a couple days ago, the U.S. embassy was targeted with rocket strikes. And so that could be how an Iran-U.S. war escalates, is in Iraq, because the U.S. thinks that all of these different paramilitary groups that helped fight ISIS in Iraq, because they're close with Iran, they call them Iranian proxies. And these are the people that want America to get out and leave. And so the U.S. could actually have a war with Iran inside Iraq. That's a real possibility. The question is whether the U.S. is willing to actually I don't know that there's an appetite for war. So like, we'll have to see what happens. But I kept rambling on, so I don't remember exactly what the question was. I was trying to answer the Iran war one. But you asked the question about Iraq demonstrations. I think you're talking about the demonstrations from last Friday that were about demanding the U.S. leave.
Right.
That was just that was definitely a show of force. If you read the signs, they had signs in English at those demonstrations saying either you can leave alive or you can leave in coffins. Like, Iraqis are pissed. They're not going to back down. And if the U.S. stays and continues to violate Iraqi sovereignty without any sort of deal with the government, then you're going to see more tensions with Iraqi groups hitting back at the Americans. And so that could potentially start another war in Iraq, So, I think what you see right now is you see Mike Pompeo in charge of policy on the Middle East, and you're seeing a disaster unfold for everyone involved. But at the end of the day, America dramatically weakened its position, which I'm not upset about. I think it's good for America to have less involvement in the Middle East. But as a result, the U.S. this relationship with Iraq will never, ever, ever be the same.
Well, Rania, we are out of time, but I really do appreciate you being on this episode of Primo Nutmeg. For folks out there who would like to follow you and stay up to date with you, how can they do that?
You can follow me on Twitter, Rania Khalek, @RaniaKhalek, or you can check out my website, RaniaKhalek.com, or you can follow the channel that I do videos for, which is called SOAPBOX. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for doing this interview, and hopefully we can have you back at some point in the future.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.